Welcome back, sailors. This is your captain speaking, and welcome back to the Bruise News. We got some interesting stuff to talk about today. There was a new UFC deal that just got struck with ESPN 2 that a lot of people have been wondering about, and it's really interesting because what it means is that ESPN is going to be paying the UFC as if every pay-per-view sells for 500K buys, which is really awesome for the UFC because no matter how many buys the pay-per-view has, they always get house seats on top of that. And certain fighters do get a percentage of that, so it won't affect them as much, but I'm about to get into that. What it means for the 500K pay-per-view buys is that headliners for UFC cards will all be paid the same amount now. So selling your fights for, like, say, Conor or Khabib or Tony or guys that are really good at talking themselves into main events and making more money, it was a really big issue a few years back because Uriah Faber did a pay-per-view against, I can't remember off the top of my head who it was, but he did a pay-per-view and Uriah Faber made $156K off of the pay-per-view, and his opponent, who was higher ranked and ended up winning the fight, only ended up getting $52K. And that's something that ends up happening a lot with a lot of fighters. You know, Conor ends up getting a payday of $3 million, where Nate gets a payday of $500K. And they really should be making the same amount, especially when certain guys end up winning the fight, like Nate did in the first one. It's really good for a lot of fighters because you're only as good as your last fight, and it's more about their performance and less about your mouth getting you to where you are. Now, I do think that there's still an upside to that, where talking is still going to be able to get you into those main event spots where you can sell fights. But what you're doing instead of selling the fights is you're actually just selling yourself to get into the main event, which is good for a lot of fighters. You know, staying on top means you get a better paycheck. Staying on top also means, you know, putting out what you say you're worth, which is a huge thing and what the UFC really should have been about the entire time. I really like that deal. I really like it. And although it's not as lucrative in some aspects for the lower tier fighters, like when it was with Adidas and stuff like that, they're still going to have their chance to be able to make something because everybody's going to be making the same amount in certain spots. That means if you're in the prelims, you're making a certain amount. If you're on the main card, you're making a certain amount. If you're on the first fight of the card, you're making the same amount. So each fighter has more incentive to do better performance-wise than they did before, which is huge. Another thing that we're going to get into is that Conor made it back into the news. He released a tweet about Khabib's wife because Khabib had posted his wedding pictures on Twitter, and there was obviously some beef going along with that. If you want to go look at the images on Twitter, Facebook, through Conor's Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff, you can see. Oh, actually, I think that he deleted them. I think that's another part of what I had written down. He actually deleted them. I'm sure that you'll be able to see them on somewhere there, or if you go on another video, because I don't have those types of captions in my videos yet, but we're getting there. I'm starting to learn certain things. But Conor had actually said that Khabib's wife looked like a towel because she had the headdress draped over her face, which it did, you know, I'm not going to lie, it did look like he was dating a ghost, but that's just a typical Muslim headdress that the female wears during the weddings. So it's sort of, well, it wasn't sort of, it was super disrespectful to say that, as Khabib is a Muslim, and, you know, along with insulting Khabib, he also insulted, what, 1 billion Muslims? There's like 1 billion Muslims on the planet. So, I mean, you got to watch what you say sometimes. I think it's kind of petty. And then he went and he was saying stuff about Khabib, saying, oh, you're not going to take the title fight, but at the end of the day, you'll do what you say, you dirty dog, or you'll do what you're told, you dirty dog. And I don't really see how Conor's in the position to do that. I went off on my last video, which I do apologize for it being sideways. I was trying something new, and then once I did the video, I still think we're in the building stages, so I didn't really take the time to destroy it and bring it back. I didn't say that really correctly at all, but you know what I mean. I was going to redo the entire video, but with my channel still growing, it'll just have to be one of those things where we'll just have to chalk it up for a mistake, and, you know, it'll be there forever. Anyways, going on, Khabib had said that Conor, is just acting like a child at this moment, which is something typical that Khabib has said. He's not very good at trash talking. He's sort of like a pseudo-intellectual where he tries to come off smarter than he is and tries to throw off all these philosophical and religious statements that just don't seem right in the situation and the context. Which, it isn't terrible coming from Conor's perspective. It makes it easy job for Conor, though, because it just adds more ammo to Conor. But Conor isn't getting through to Khabib. I don't think Khabib's smart enough to be getting these euphemisms and all that stuff that Conor tends to use. Conor's far too smart and far too good at shit talking that he's ever going to get anything from Khabib other than, the flying eagle over the cage on Dylan Dennis. That was crazy. It was absolutely nuts. I thought Joe Rogan was going to cry. Honestly, I thought he was going to cry. He was so upset. Anyways, going back to that, it was pretty silly for Conor to say what he did, and Khabib showed pictures about the bitch versus the lion and all that stuff, and then Khabib actually he had made a couple odd statements about it, and then saying like he's going to end up fighting the winner of Poirier versus Holloway, which is an interesting fight because they had a rematch, or they had a match 7 years ago, and that pay-per-view is coming up, and I will eventually get my predictions out for that video, so stay tuned. Continuing on with that, Artem Lobov, the Russian Hammer, the GOAT, the greatest of all time, Mr. 15 and 15 himself, Conor's training partner, he was talking about Paulie Malignaggi because they got into some beef because they're supposed to be having a boxing match. Artem's about to fight in the bare knuckle boxing league, and then he wants to fight Paulie, and they were talking some trash, and Paulie ended up slapping Artem in the face. And Artem is one of those guys, like, he's not the best MMA fighter, but he's still a savage, and he was talking about stomping Paulie out in the street. He's like, if I see him in the street, I'm going to stomp on his head. And that's a gangster move right there. Like who says that to somebody, especially on live TV? You don't say that. You keep that secret and you just let it happen, right? Anyways, after that, Conor, as a trying to bring it back up, he had just posted picture after picture after picture because Paulie was one of Conor's training partners for the match in the first place. So when Conor was training for Mayweather, he brought in Paulie to train with him, just to get another boxer's perspective. And Paulie absolutely got dominated by Conor in the boxing ring because, that's the way it goes. Conor's money and Paulie's not. So Paulie's the one that ended up having to take a beating, even though chances are that Paulie probably still would have beat Conor in an actual boxing ring. It just doesn't seem like that when you see those pictures. But the truth is that when you bring in guys to train like that, you're effectively being brought in as a punching bag. And, you'll be able to see the pictures, and that's exactly what happened. On a side note to all that, Anthony Johnson works with Paulie Malignaggi in his training camp and in those gyms, and he was looking gigantic. And he was talking about fighting John Jones at heavyweight, and if he was going to make a return, he would make a return against John Jones at heavyweight, and he was looking huge. If you get the chance to watch the Artem versus Paulie scuffle that they had in the gym, and you can see the video, you can see Anthony Johnson is the guy holding back Paulie, and he's huge. There's a reason why they called him Fat Bastard when he was outside of the octagon, when he was outside of the UFC. He went from being, 175 and cutting that 20 pounds from 195 to being 285 outside of the UFC. Disgusting. He's one of those dudes who's been all over the place. Moving forward a little bit more, Dana came out and he said that there's no possible way that he's ever going to make a 165-pound division. He said that if he makes a 265, if he makes a 165-pound division, it would drain welterweight and lightweight. And he says he's not interested in doing that. And I think that's really weird because when you have such a high competitive level of guys in both lightweight, you could argue that lightweight and welterweight are the two most populated and the two most competitive weight divisions in the UFC. When you think about it, I don't actually think there's any discussion about it. I don't think that middleweight has anybody close to that. Light heavyweight doesn't have anybody close to that. Heavyweight doesn't. Featherweight really doesn't, because Holloway's about to move up and Holloway's dominated everybody. So who is there? Brian Ortega? That's about it. You got a couple guys moving up. You got Chan Sung Jung. You got a couple people, Zabit. But there's a couple people coming up, but compared to the guys that are in lightweight and welterweight, there's just no names. Like, those two divisions are stacked. They are absolutely stacked. And there are guys in that division that'll never be champion because of certain people like Conor or Khabib that don't take a lot of fights. Same with Woodley. Woodley's not champion anymore, and I expect Usman to make more title defenses, but it's tough. When you have 9-10 guys in that division that could all be fighting for titles, Pettis, Stephen Thompson, Lawler, Askren, Masvidal, just to name a couple, and I'm leaving a bunch out. Colby Covington, even though he's trash, but whatever, You have a bunch of guys who could fight for the title and win the title at welterweight, and the same goes for lightweight. Speaking outside of Khabib, you have a bunch of those guys who could easily be champions and easily have lots of defenses under their names, and they're not getting those shots because there's not enough room. So why not make a 165 and drain the divisions a little bit? You make a whole new division, you make more competitive fights happening, you make another champion. It's just, the only thing is, I feel like if they make a 165, they need to bump 170 up to 175, and then there's 185 and 205. And I always like the idea of the UFC having super weights in between, like they did for boxing, but then it really does end up draining the divisions. And then you have a lot of guys moving up, and then they're fighting at 205. Let's say Jones goes and he has the 205 championship. Say they make a 225 weight class, and then they make a super heavyweight. So then you have John Jones winning the 225-pound belt because that's easy he's basically walking in and around the ring at 225. So if he ends up winning that title, then you have a guy who's not defending a title now in two weight classes. He has to separate them both because, under the UFC's conditions, they have certain rules under USADA that makes it so fighters have to take an allotted amount of time off regardless if they have injuries or not. So it becomes a convoluted sort of situation. Yes, I think that 165 is a division that would work under the circumstances because of how competitive welterweight and lightweight are. I think that you might have to do some shuffling around and you might have to change the weight classes a little bit, but I do think that will work. In other divisions, not right now. There's not enough heavyweights to make a whole other division, like a super heavyweight division, unless the UFC mass buys a bunch of people. But a lot of those dudes, and like a lot of the heavyweights we see outside of the UFC and even inside of the UFC, end up being, kind of big guys that aren't really seeming like they're really worth too much money outside of, a couple of the dudes that end up being really good, like Kane and Ngannou. Ngannou's kind of like a little bit of a special case because he's really just got the hands, and there's a lot of guys like that. Like Derek Lewis. Derek Lewis is not a good MMA fighter, but he's weirdly athletic. Like, he does those jumping roundhouse kicks, like the jumping switch roundhouses. Like, it's crazy that a guy that size with a bad back is pulling that off, but what can you do? Some dudes just got it, some others don't. Other than that, I don't think there's anything else that I really wanted to say. Colby Covington, I think, made a couple weird statements. I guess we'll end with this. This is a lame ending, but, they can't all be gems. Colby Covington is just an absolutely horrendous trash talker. He's just so bad. He's such a bitch. And I say that with open arms for him to come at me because, honestly, the guy is not intimidating at all. I don't know if anybody ever saw anything about Colby Covington, but the guy talks so much trash, and he talks about busting skulls and about how nobody wants to fight him. And then Fabricio Verdum hucked a boomerang at him. I'm not kidding. It was a boomerang. He hucked a boomerang at him. And Colby Covington literally called the cops and got Verdum arrested. Yeah, that guy's going to bust your skull all right. It's not the first time he does stuff. He's super confrontational, but every time he's confrontational, it's when people are around him, getting in between. He's calling people bitches. He's saying that he'd stomp Usman out and that he'd punch him out if he saw him in the street. We're fighting. We're going to fight, bro. Like, come on. Like, go back to college and do that stuff with your bros. You know what I mean? Like, that's some frat boy stuff you're talking about. Get out of here with that. Anyways, I want to thank everybody for coming. I hope this video is a lot better. I'm just about to try and do some things with editing, and we'll see how that goes. I hope that everybody likes it. I hope that this video was informative, which is what we're going for. And let's like, share, and subscribe and get this out there. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.